The entertainment business knew how to sell Peter Allen's joy. It did not know how to make room for his grief. He was the Oscar-winning songwriter connected to Liza Minnelli and Judy Garland, a performer audiences expected to lift the room. But the life he could not fully show was the one he shared with Gregory Connell, his longtime partner, who died of an AIDS-related illness in 1984. Allen kept working in an industry that still preferred silence around gay men and AIDS. 8 years later, AIDS-related throat cancer took him too. The show went on because the business needed the joy. The grief was what he had to carry alone. Peter Allen did not begin inside a grand theater. He began as Peter Richard Woolnough, a boy born in Tenterfield, New South Wales, and later raised in Armadale. His first real stage was not polished or glamorous. It was the ladies' lounge of the New England Hotel, where he started playing piano when he was 11. Think of a small country hotel in the late afternoon. Old carpet underfoot, cigarette smoke hanging in the room, glasses set down too hard on wooden tables, adults talking over the music because the boy at the piano was useful but not yet important. He learned early that a room could change if he kept playing. A noisy table would quiet down. Someone would turn their head. A stranger might drop a coin near the piano. For most children, applause is a treat. For Peter, it seems to have become something more practical. It gave him a place to stand. It gave him a job to do. It gave adults a reason to look at him with approval instead of anger or pity. That mattered because home was not easy. Biographical records describe his father, Richard Woolnough, as a former soldier and grocer whose drinking became heavy and whose temper could turn violent. That does not explain everything about the house, but it tells us enough. A child in that kind of home learns to read footsteps. He learns the sound of a door being opened too fast. He learns when to speak, when to stay quiet, and when to get out of the room. Music gave Peter a way out without having to call it escape. He could say he was working. He could say people wanted to hear him play. He could sit behind a piano and keep his hands moving while the rest of the world stayed at a safer distance. Then in November of 1958, the family broke in a way no song could cover. Peter was 14 when his father took his own life. The exact private details belong to that family, but the public record is clear on the result. Soon after, Peter left school and moved to Lismore with his mother and sister. Childhood did not slowly fade for him. It was cut short. 1 month he was a boy with a difficult father and a local reputation as a gifted performer. The next, he was living with the fact that the man who had frightened him was also gone forever. That kind of loss can twist a young person in ways outsiders do not notice. People often expect grief to look like crying in public, collapsing into someone's arms, or refusing to get out of bed. Peter's grief seems to have gone somewhere tighter. He had already learned that a bright face could keep questions away. After his father's death, that lesson became harder. Smile. Keep moving. Do not let the room see too much. In country towns of that period, especially for boys, pain was not something people welcomed. Men were expected to swallow it. A son was expected to carry on. If there was shame in the family, you kept it indoors. That is why Peter's later brightness should never be mistaken for simple happiness. The wide grin, the quick joke, the lifted leg on the piano, the rush of energy across a stage. Those things were real, but they were also useful. They gave him control over rooms that might otherwise have judged him. They let him decide what people saw first. Before anyone could ask about the father, the drinking, the fear, or the silence after Armadale, Peter gave them speed. He gave them charm. He gave them a reason to laugh. Years later, he would help write a song called Don't Cry Out Loud. It would be risky to say that one song explains his entire life. Songs are not court records, but the title alone carries a hard echo. Keep it inside. Hide the break. Make the performance clean enough that no one asks what it costs. That was not just show business polish. For Peter, it had roots in childhood. By the time he left those small rooms behind, he had already learned one of the central rules of entertainment. The audience does not always want the truth. Often, it wants relief. It wants the performer to walk in carrying color, noise, and confidence, even when the person underneath is running on damage. Peter became very good at that. Too good, maybe. The boy from Armadale found a way to make people feel lighter, but the habit that saved him early would later trap him in public. The brighter he became, the less room there was for anyone to ask what he had survived. By his teens, Peter had already learned that talent was not enough. In Australia, the entertainment circuit was small, practical, and unforgiving. A young performer did not get to sit around waiting for the perfect role. He took the work that was offered. He played where people would pay. He learned quickly that every room had its own rules, and if he wanted to stay employed, he had to understand those rules before the audience even settled into their seats. During those early years, he performed in local venues, clubs, and stage shows across northern New South Wales and beyond. The work was not glamorous. It meant cheap dressing rooms, fast rehearsals, borrowed pianos, and adults who expected a boy to act like a professional before he had even finished growing up. He could play by ear, which gave him an advantage. If someone called out a tune, he could usually find it. If the room was flat, he knew how to push it. If the crowd was restless, he knew how to make himself bigger than the noise. This is where Peter began to understand performance as a kind of discipline. He was not just singing songs, he was studying people. He watched when they laughed. He noticed when they looked away. He learned how long to hold a smile before it became too much, how fast to move before the room lost him, and how to make a piano feel less like furniture and more like something he could command. Later, audiences would see the high kicks and the flamboyant shirts and think it was all spontaneous. It was not. That kind of ease is usually built from hard, repetitive labor in rooms where nobody gives you much mercy. Before he became Peter Allen, he became part of the Allen brothers, performing with Chris Bell. The name sounded like family, but it was show business. It gave the act a clean shape. Two young men, bright, energetic, easy to sell. They could fit into clubs, television appearances, and touring bills. For Peter, the duo offered something valuable, a way to leave the narrow life that had closed around him after his father's death. It also taught him another rule. The public does not only buy music, it buys packaging, a name, a look, a story simple enough to print in a program. The Australian audiences of that period were not asking for confession. They wanted polish. They wanted charm. They wanted a performer who could make a hard week feel lighter for an hour. Peter gave them that. Yet behind the bright timing, there was a young man already becoming careful about what he revealed. He had grown up in a culture where men did not speak easily about fear or grief. Now he was entering a business where private life could become public property overnight. He learned to keep the personal material locked away and sell only the usable parts. That skill would become more important as his world widened. A performer could be one version of himself in a family-friendly setting and another version late at night in a club. He could be clean, quick, and harmless for one crowd, then sharper and more daring for another. This was not just acting, it was survival training. Every audience gave him a different mirror. He adjusted himself to each one. A raised eyebrow here, a bigger laugh there, a little more camp when the room could take it, a little less when the room felt dangerous. Peter's stage personality grew out of that pressure. It was not a lie exactly, but it was not the whole man either. The loudness protected the quiet parts. The jokes protected the wounds. The speed kept anyone from looking too closely. When he stepped onto a stage, he could become bold in ways that private life did not always allow. He could push the room, tease it, charm it, and then slip away before the questions got too personal. That split became one of his greatest tools. It also carried a cost. The better he became at changing shape for an audience, the harder it became for anyone to know where the performance ended. Friends could see flashes of the private Peter, but the public got the finished product. Bright teeth, fast hands, high energy, no visible crack. In a business built on appetite, that kind of performer is useful. He gives the crowd what it came for and leaves the difficult material off stage. By the time the wider entertainment world noticed him, Peter had already been trained by tougher rooms than any Broadway house. He knew how to win over strangers. He knew how to cover discomfort with timing. He knew how to look fearless, even when the floor underneath him was shifting. That made him valuable. It made him marketable. And it made him ready for the next turn in his life, when a connection to Judy Garland would pull him out of the Australian circuit and place him inside one of the most famous, closely watched families in show business. The opening came in Hong Kong. Peter and Chris Bell, billed as the Allen brothers, had been working the Asian club circuit, doing the kind of act that had to grab a room quickly or disappear. Two young Australian performers, sharp suits, fast timing, clean harmonies, enough cheek to make a hotel audience look up from its drinks. It was not the top of show business, it was the edge of it. But sometimes the edge is where the right person happens to be sitting. According to several accounts, the person who noticed them first was Mark Herron, the actor who was then close to Judy Garland and would later become her fourth husband. That detail matters because it keeps the story honest. Peter was not suddenly discovered by magic. He was seen by someone standing near a much larger spotlight. Herron helped bring the act to Garland's attention, and Garland seemed to understand quickly that the boys had something useful on stage. They were young. They were bright. They could warm up a crowd without threatening the main event. For a star like Garland, that kind of opening act was not decoration. It was part of the machinery that kept a show moving. Judy Garland did not need to be painted as a villain for this moment to feel dangerous. Her name alone changed the pressure in the room. She was not just a singer. She was one of the most famous women in the world, carrying the weight of old Hollywood, bad contracts, public hunger, and private exhaustion. Anyone brought into her orbit was stepping into a place where affection, opportunity, business, and need could get tangled very quickly. For Peter, the offer to work near Garland was enormous. It meant America. It meant major stages. It meant doors that a boy from country New South Wales could not open by himself. By late 1964, Peter was no longer only a club performer trying to hold a room in Asia. He was moving with the Garland world. That world had its own weather, airports, rehearsals, hotel corridors, managers, photographers, and people who spoke in urgent voices while pretending everything was normal. Peter had spent years learning how to read a room. Now the room was much bigger, and the stakes were harsher. A wrong impression could follow you. A rumor could move faster than a contract. A smile could protect you, but only if you knew when to use it. It was in this period that he met Liza Minnelli. She was Judy Garland's daughter, still a teenager when Peter first entered that circle, and already living under a public name she had not chosen. Liza was not simply Judy's daughter, though the press often treated her that way. She had talent of her own, ambition of her own, and a face people studied because they wanted to see her mother in it. That is a heavy way to grow up. Peter understood something about performing before people knew who you really were. Liza understood it too. The meeting between them has often been wrapped in a neat show business glow, as if two young performers just stepped into the same hallway and romance took over. The truth was likely more complicated. Judy encouraged the match. The press liked the match. The industry could understand the match. A charming Australian entertainer linked to the daughter of Judy Garland was easy to print, easy to sell, and easy to believe. It made Peter look safer. It made Liza's young public life look romantic. It gave everyone a story that did not ask difficult questions. That does not mean there was no feeling between them. There was. People who reduce the marriage to a simple cover story miss the more painful part. Peter and Liza seemed to have cared for each other deeply. They were funny together. They understood performance. They both knew what it meant to be watched too closely. The trouble was not that everything between them was fake. The trouble was that real affection was being asked to carry a truth it could not hold. Soon the engagement was announced. According to press accounts at the time, they did not rush straight into marriage. They waited roughly 2 years before taking that step. But the public story was already moving. Once the entertainment press had a version of Peter it could use, that version began to harden around him. He was no longer just Peter Allen, the rising performer. He became the young man tied to Judy Garland's family. He became Liza Minnelli's fiancé. He became a figure inside one of the most watched families in American entertainment. For a performer trying to build a career in the middle 1960s, that kind of connection could protect him. It could also trap him. The closer Peter stood to Garland and Minnelli, the brighter the flashbulbs became. The brighter the flashbulbs became, the less room he had to be uncertain, private, or unfinished. The industry did not want a complicated young man still working out who he was. It wanted a clean photograph. It wanted a wedding announcement. It wanted a story the public could swallow without choking. Peter had spent his life learning how to give people what they expected. Now Hollywood was offering him the biggest role yet, the charming husband-to-be, the safe man beside a beloved young star, the bright Australian who had been welcomed into a famous American family. He knew how to play a role. He also knew that some roles become harder to remove the longer you wear them. Peter and Liza married on March 3, 1967 in New York. The public version was easy to package. Judy Garland's daughter, young, talented, already famous in her own right, marrying the bright Australian entertainer Judy had helped bring into her circle. The photographs gave newspapers exactly what they wanted: 2 performers, 2 smiles, a famous mother in the background, a wedding that looked clean, charming, and safe. But photographs are cruel that way. They freeze the part of the room that knows how to behave. They do not show the private doubts waiting outside the frame. They do not show what a young man chooses not to say because saying it could cost him work, reputation, and safety. In the late 1960s, an openly gay male performer was not simply taking a personal risk. He was putting his entire career in front of gossip columnists, bookers, managers, and television executives who could close doors without ever explaining why. That is the part modern viewers have to sit with for a moment. Peter was not making choices in the world we know now. He was working in a business where image could decide whether a man got hired. A marriage certificate could quiet questions. A wife on your arm could calm the press. A public romance with a beloved young woman could make a performer look acceptable to people who were looking for any reason to doubt him. That does not mean Peter married Liza with no feeling. It means the marriage also served a purpose that the industry understood very well. Liza was not a fool in this story, and she should not be treated like a prop. She was young, famous, vulnerable, and already carrying the weight of a mother whose life had been watched and judged by millions. She loved Peter, or at least the Peter she was allowed to know. By many accounts, he was funny, attentive, talented, and warm. For someone raised inside the pressure of show business, those qualities would have mattered. Peter knew the strange hours. He knew the backstage nerves. He knew the cost of smiling when strangers expected you to perform happiness on command. That is what makes the marriage painful instead of simple. It was not just a cold arrangement. There was real tenderness inside it. There were probably ordinary moments too. Hotel rooms after shows, meals eaten too late, laughter over some absurd piece of press coverage, the small relief of sitting with someone who understood what public life could do to a person. But tenderness cannot erase a truth that has to be hidden every morning. Affection can make a secret heavier because now the secret is hurting someone who trusted you. Peter had spent years dividing himself for different rooms. With Liza, that division moved into the center of his life. In public, he could be the husband, the charming young man beside a rising star, the safe member of a famous entertainment family. In private, the questions did not disappear. They only became harder to name. The more people accepted the public story, the more dangerous it became to disturb it. The marriage began to strain under that weight. By 1970, Peter and Liza had separated. Their divorce would not be finalized until 1974. but the public shape of the relationship had already broken. Later, Liza spoke bluntly about discovering that Peter was gay. In one well-known interview, she said she would never surprise anyone by coming home again without calling first. The line is often repeated because it sounds sharp, almost funny. It is not funny when you slow it down. It is the sound of someone remembering shock, humiliation, and pain. The exact private scene has been retold in different ways, and it is better not to dress it up more than the record can support. What matters is clear enough. Liza came face to face with a part of Peter's life she had not been allowed to understand fully. For her, it was a personal wound. For him, it was the collapse of a public protection he had depended on. For both of them, it showed how ugly the system could be. Hollywood had pushed men like Peter to hide, then punished the people caught inside the hiding. After the separation, Peter lost more than a marriage. He lost a shield. Being attached to Liza Minnelli and Judy Garland had placed him inside a famous circle, but it had also given the public a story that made him easier to accept. Once that story fell apart, he had to stand more directly in his own name. He was talented enough to survive it, but survival is not the same as peace. By then, Peter had already learned how to keep moving after a private break. He went back to work. He wrote. He performed. He smiled when the room expected him to smile. But the next chapter of his life would not be built around a woman the press could recognize. It would be built around a man the industry would not let him claim. After the marriage to Liza broke apart, Peter did what working performers often do. He went back into rooms with microphones, piano benches, bad lighting, and people waiting to be entertained. New York did not give him privacy, but it gave him space to rebuild. He was no longer protected by the neat public story of being Liza Minnelli's husband. He had to sell himself again, this time as Peter Allen, solo performer, songwriter, and man in motion. In 1973, one of those rooms was the Continental Baths in the basement of the Ansonia Hotel on Manhattan's Upper West Side. It was not a normal showroom. It was a gay nightlife venue with a bathhouse attached. And it also had a stage, a band, and a nightlife reputation that reached far beyond the men who actually went there. Performers came through that room because the crowd was sharp, loud, and hard to fool. If they liked you, they gave it back with full force. If they did not, you felt the room cool down in seconds. For Peter, that kind of place made sense. He had always been good in rooms where the rules were not polite. The Continental Baths did not need him to look like a husband in a newspaper photograph. It did not need him to explain Judy Garland or Liza Minnelli. It wanted nerve. It wanted timing. It wanted a performer who could sit at a piano and make the whole basement lean forward. There, at least for the length of a set, Peter did not have to polish himself into something safe for Middle America. That was where Gregory Connell entered his life. The cleanest version of the record says that Greg and a mutual friend attended one of Peter's shows at the Continental Baths in 1973. Greg was a fashion model, young, good-looking, and not trying to become another piece of Peter's celebrity machine. That may be one reason the connection mattered. Peter had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from his name, his access, or his energy. Greg seems to have met him in a room where the stage was small enough for the person behind the act to come through. Their relationship did not arrive inside a world ready to protect it. Two men could love each other in private, but the public business around them still demanded a cover story. Hotel clerks noticed, managers noticed, reporters noticed. A man traveling too often with another man could become a question. In the 1970s, a question could become a whisper, and a whisper could become a problem for bookings, records, television, and money. Peter had already lived long enough inside show business to understand that risk. So Greg's place in Peter's life had to be practical as well as personal. Over time, he became part of the work around Peter's career. He helped with the stage life, the travel, the show details, the lighting, the sound, the hard jobs that make a performer look effortless from the seats. That arrangement gave them a reason to be together in public. It gave outsiders an answer before they could ask the wrong question. Greg was not introduced as the man Peter loved. He was part of the show. There is a quiet cost in that kind of arrangement. Greg had his own face, his own work, his own life before Peter. A model is paid to be seen. But beside Peter, visibility became dangerous. To stay close, Greg had to accept a role that could be explained away. He could be in the theater, in the booth, backstage, on the road, in the hotel, near the center of Peter's life, but still not fully named for what he was. That is not a small sacrifice. It is the kind of compromise people make when the world gives them no clean option. Peter, for his part, seems to have built around Greg a private center that the public could not reach. On stage, he still gave the audience everything: the grin, the raised eyebrows, the piano, the jokes, the sudden bursts of movement that made the room feel awake. But somewhere behind that performance, there was now one person whose opinion mattered differently. Not a critic, not a record executive, not a fan waiting at the stage door. Greg saw the work from the inside. He knew what had to happen before the spotlight hit Peter's face. That changed the meaning of the show. Every performance still belonged to the paying crowd, but it also carried a private signal, a glance toward the back of the room, a line tossed off like a joke, a moment of trust between the man on stage and the man making sure the stage held together. Most people in the audience would never have known what they were seeing. They thought they were watching Peter Allen sell joy. They were also watching him build a life in the narrow space the industry left him. And then, just as Greg became the steady part of Peter's private world, Peter's songwriting began to carry a different kind of ache. The public would hear it as romance. Radio would file it under love songs. But some of those words sound much heavier when you know who Peter could not openly sing them to. In 1974, the American public heard "I Honestly Love You" as a soft confession from Olivia Newton-John. Her voice made the song feel innocent, almost too gentle to question. Radio programmers could place it anywhere, in a car, in a kitchen, in a department store. It sounded clean, romantic, and safe. That was part of its power. The song went to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart, and the recording later won major Grammy Awards for Olivia Newton-John. On paper, it was a perfect pop success. Simple words, a calm melody, a beautiful singer, and no obvious threat to anyone listening. But Peter Allen helped write those words with Jeff Barry, and that fact changes the weight of the song. It does not mean every line should be treated like a direct diary entry. That would be too easy, and it would not be honest. Songwriters borrow, reshape, and hide inside characters all the time. Still, when you know what Peter was living through, the song does not feel quite as simple. It becomes harder to hear it as just another ballad about bad timing. It starts to sound like a careful piece of emotional evidence, written by a man who knew exactly what could be said in public and what had to be moved through someone else's voice. That is the part most listeners in 1974 would not have stopped to consider. Olivia Newton-John could sing about a love that could not happen, and America could accept it without fear. She was wholesome. She was marketable. She made longing sound respectable. If Peter had sung the same kind of confession in a way that pointed too clearly toward another man, the room would have changed. The song might have stopped being treated as romance and started being treated as a problem. That was the trap. The feeling could be sold, but only if the public did not have to face its real shape. There is a quiet cruelty in that arrangement. Peter's pain could travel across the country, but only after it had been cleaned, softened, and placed inside a voice the public found acceptable. People could hum along without asking who the song might be protecting. They could feel moved by the ache while still living inside a culture that made that ache necessary. That does not make the audience evil. Most of them did not know. But it does show how entertainment can hide a wound so well that the wound becomes profitable. The success changed Peter's position. A hit song did what sympathy could not do. It gave him money, leverage, and a little more control. By the middle of the 1970s, he had enough power to buy something more valuable than another suit, another party, or another mention in a column. He bought privacy. In 1975, Peter and Greg made a home in Leucadia, a quiet coastal community north of San Diego. It was not the kind of place that screamed celebrity. It had salt air, low buildings, beach roads, and the sound of the Pacific pushing against the shore. That house mattered because it gave them a physical place where the public story did not have to be performed every minute. On the road, Greg could be explained as part of the professional team. In the theater, he could be near Peter without being named too clearly. But behind the closed door in Leucadia, the arrangement could breathe. They could eat breakfast without watching every gesture. They could sit in the same room without calculating how it might look to a stranger. They could be ordinary in a way that fame often steals from people. For Peter, ordinary life may have been the real luxury. He had known applause since childhood. He had known powerful people, famous rooms, and the strange heat that comes from being watched. What he had rarely been allowed was a life that did not need to be translated for outsiders. Leucadia gave him that for a while, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to matter. The money earned from a song the public heard as harmless romance helped create a private home for a love the public was not ready to name. There is no need to turn that house into a myth. It was wood, windows, bills, furniture, clothes in closets, work calls, travel schedules, and ordinary arguments like any other home. That is what makes it important. Peter and Greg did not need a fantasy. They needed a place where the door could close and the performance could stop. For a man who had spent his life giving rooms exactly what they wanted, that kind of silence was not empty. It was relief. Outside that door, the business kept moving. Records had to be sold. Shows had to be booked. Executives still measured a man by how much money he could bring in. Peter's brightness remained useful to them. His private life remained something they preferred not to discuss too clearly. And in the same Los Angeles offices where contracts were signed and careers were shaped, the contempt underneath the smiles was beginning to show. By the late 1970s, Peter Allen was no longer just a name attached to Judy Garland and Liza Minnelli. He had become a business. He wrote songs other artists wanted. He toured. He recorded. He worked with A&M Records, a label that knew how to sell bright surfaces, sharp hooks, and performers who could make adults feel young for 3 minutes at a time. Peter fit that machine well, at least from the outside. He could walk into a room wearing a loud shirt, sit at the piano, and make the whole place feel less stiff. That did not mean the men behind the desks respected him. Accounts from that period describe a familiar pattern inside the industry. Peter's talent made money. His personality filled rooms. His songs traveled through other people's voices and came back as checks. But behind closed doors, some executives still treated his private life like a joke. The same people who could profit from his flamboyance were uncomfortable with what it suggested when the stage lights were off. Think about the ugliness of that arrangement. A performer walks into the office with songs, tour numbers, and proof that the public is paying attention. He leaves, and the room relaxes into cheap laughter. Men in suits, sitting near contracts and ashtrays, making comments they would not dare say into a microphone, not because they were brave, because the room protected them. That was how much of the entertainment business operated in those years. It smiled in public and sneered in private. Peter was not the only artist forced to live with that split. Many performers had to pass through offices where the people controlling their careers were also judging their bodies, their voices, their clothes, and their private lives. But Peter's case had a sharp edge because his very style was part of what they were selling. The open shirts, the camp timing, the physical looseness, the grin that seemed to dare the audience to keep up. All of that made him distinct. It made him valuable. Yet the business wanted the profit without the person attached to it. Jerry Moss, the co-founder of A&M Records, is often remembered as someone who did draw a line. According to industry accounts, when jokes about Peter's sexuality went too far inside the label, Moss made it clear that Peter's personal life was not their business. That mattered. In a room where one powerful man could set the tone, a sentence like that could stop the laughter. It could remind the staff that Peter was not just a product moving through their system. He was a working artist whose talent was keeping their offices busy. But that kind of protection came with its own bitter lesson. Peter's dignity should not have depended on whether a powerful executive happened to be decent that day. It should not have taken a boss at the end of a conference table to tell grown men to behave like professionals. That was the problem with the era. Safety was personal, not structural. If the right person liked you, you might be protected. If the wrong person wanted to hurt you, the door could close fast. Peter understood that better than most. He did not answer the industry by shrinking. He became larger. On stage, he pushed the image further. Brighter shirts, quicker jokes, bigger movements, more nerve. The high kicks were not random decoration. The open energy was not careless. He knew exactly what a room expected from him, and then he gave it so much that the room had to surrender. If people were going to talk, he would make sure they were talking about the show, the songs, the applause, and the money he could bring in. The strategy worked. He built a career that was hard to ignore. In 1981, he helped write Arthur's theme, also known as Best That You Can Do, with Burt Bacharach, Carol Bayer Sager, and Christopher Cross. The song became a major hit and won the Academy Award for Best Original Song. That Oscar placed Peter in a category the industry could not laugh away. A man can be mocked in a boardroom, but a gold statue changes the way people say his name. Still, success did not make him safe. It only made the contradiction harder to hide. Publicly, Peter could be celebrated as a gifted songwriter and a thrilling live performer. Privately, he still had to manage what people knew, what they guessed, and what they were willing to punish. Greg remained close to him, working around the shows, the tours, the technical pieces, the daily structure that kept Peter moving. Their life together existed in plain view, but only if you knew how to read it. That was the cruel trick. Peter could stand in front of thousands of people and be adored, but the most important relationship in his life still had to be handled carefully. A look could be explained away. A job title could cover a deeper truth. A shared home could remain out of frame. The audience bought tickets to see freedom. The man selling it was still negotiating how much of himself the world would tolerate. Then the early 1980s changed the air. At first, the reports were scattered and confusing. Men were getting sick. Doctors did not have clear answers. Newspapers used cold language. Politicians moved slowly. In gay communities across New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and beyond, people began noticing empty chairs, canceled plans, and friends who looked thinner each time they appeared. For Peter and Greg, the crisis was not a headline for long. It came through the front door. By 1984, Gregory Connell was no longer just the man beside Peter Allen. He was part of the working structure of Peter's life. He knew the travel, the cues, the rooms, the moods before a show. He understood when Peter needed noise and when he needed silence. That kind of closeness does not show up cleanly in old press clippings. A reporter can write down a tour date. A label can count ticket sales. But the person who keeps your private world steady is harder to document, especially when the public language of the time refuses to name him honestly. The illness moved into that private world with almost no mercy. In the early 1980s, AIDS was still surrounded by fear, bad information, and ugly public judgment. Families were confused. Doctors were learning in real time. Newspapers often wrote about sick gay men as if they were a problem instead of people. The government response was slow, and the silence from powerful institutions made the fear worse. For men who already had to hide their relationships, the crisis added another layer of pressure. They were not only facing illness, they were facing illness in a society that often acted as if their grief did not deserve the same respect as anyone else's. On September 11th, 1984, Gregory Connell died from an AIDS-related illness. He was still young. Peter was left with the kind of loss that changes the shape of every room. The house in Leucadia, which had once given them space to breathe, now held the quiet after Greg was gone. The phone still rang. The business still asked questions about schedules. The world outside the door still expected Peter Allen to be Peter Allen. Loud, bright, quick with a line, ready to lift the room before anyone noticed the damage. That was the cruel bargain of his career. If a famous male star lost a wife, the public knew how to respond. There could be formal sympathy, respectful coverage, a visible pause. People understood the word widow or widower. When the marriage fit the rules, they recognized. Peter did not get that simple permission. He had lost the man who shared his life, but he could not stand before the world and speak as freely as a husband would. Too much explanation would invite too much attention. Too much honesty could pull old rumors into fresh headlines. So he kept working, not because the loss was small, not because he was untouched. Work was the only place the industry allowed him to exist without explaining himself. A stage gives a performer control for a few hours. The lights come up. The band begins. The body remembers where to stand. The mouth finds the jokes. The hands find the keys. An audience sees motion and assumes strength. It rarely asks what the performer had to leave backstage to make the motion possible. For Peter, Greg's absence was not just emotional, it was practical. The person who had helped hold the show together was gone. Every cue, every technical detail, every moment when Peter might have looked toward the booth and known someone there understood him had changed. Other people could run lights, other people could check sound, but they could not replace the private language that had built up over years. A professional can cover a job. He cannot become the man who knew why the job mattered. This is where Peter's old training returned with force. As a boy, he had learned to smile through a damaged house. As a young performer, he had learned to become whatever a room required. As Judy Garland's protégé and Liza Minnelli's husband, he had learned how public stories can protect and trap a person at the same time. After Greg's passing, those lessons tightened around him. Do not stop. Do not explain too much. Do not let the crowd see the full cost. Give them the version they paid to see. There is something hard to watch in that kind of discipline. It can look like courage from a distance, but up close it can also look like a man with no safe place to fall apart. Peter's stage energy after Greg did not simply read as joy, it carried strain. The big shirts, the open grin, the fast movement at the piano, they still worked, but they also began to feel like a shield being held up with both hands. The audience applauded the brightness. They could not know how much darkness had to be pushed down to make it. The tragedy was not only that Peter lost Greg. The tragedy was that he lost him in a time that made honest mourning difficult. Their love had been folded into job titles, travel plans, backstage routines, and shared rooms behind closed doors. When Greg was gone, Peter had to carry the truth in the same hidden way he had carried the relationship itself. The business kept selling the joy because that was the product. Peter kept giving it because he knew no other way to survive the demand. But from that point forward, every spotlight came with an empty space behind it. After Gregory was gone, Peter's performances did not become smaller. They became louder, faster, and harder to watch if you knew what had been taken from him. From the seats, it still looked like the old Peter Allen. The grin, the open shirt, the piano, the sudden kick that made the audience roar. But the energy had a different edge. It did not feel relaxed. It felt driven. He moved as if stopping would let too much catch up with him. A performer can hide many things inside rhythm. He can hide exhaustion. He can hide fear. He can hide the fact that the one person he used to look for in the dark is no longer there. The audience wanted release, and Peter knew how to give it to them. That was the job. People bought tickets after work, after dinner, after years of hearing his songs on the radio. They did not come to watch a man explain private loss. They came for I Go to Rio, for the jokes, for the sweat, for the feeling that life could still be turned up loud. Peter gave them that because he had been trained from childhood to give a room what it needed. But now the cost was heavier. Each show asked him to turn grief into motion. Each encore asked him to prove that he could still stand under the lights and make strangers happy. Broadway gave him a different kind of test in 1988. Peter had spent years trying to bring Legs Diamond to the stage, a big, expensive musical built around the story of a gangster who wanted show business glamour. It opened at the Mark Hellinger Theater on December 26, 1988, after a long preview period. Peter did not only write the music and lyrics, he starred in it. That meant the failure, when it came, landed directly on his name. The reviews were rough. The money pressure was serious. The show closed on February 19, 1989, after 64 performances and 72 previews. Reports at the time described it as one of Broadway's major commercial failures. For most performers, that kind of public hit would be crushing. A Broadway flop does not stay quiet. It sits in newspapers. It gets repeated in offices. It follows you into restaurants and dressing rooms. People lower their voices when you walk past, then pretend they were talking about something else. Peter had every reason to feel exposed. He had poured work, pride, and money into that production. He had put his own body at the center of it. Yet the reaction from him did not seem to match the scale of the failure. Those close to him often described a man who could take the blow, smile thinly, and keep moving. That does not mean he did not care. He was too much of a professional not to care. But by then, the usual punishments of show business had lost some of their power over him. Bad reviews hurt less when you have already watched your private life change permanently behind a closed door in Leucadia. A canceled show hurts less when the person who once helped hold your world together is gone. Broadway could embarrass him. It could cost him money. It could bruise his reputation. But it could not reach the deepest wound anymore. That wound had already been made. So Peter returned to the road, to concerts, to benefits, to any room where he could keep the machine running. His body was still his instrument, and he used it hard. He sang, he kicked, he leaned over the piano. He chased applause not like a young man hungry for fame, but like a man trying to stay ahead of silence. There is a difference. Hunger looks forward. Grief often runs in place. It repeats the same motion because the motion is the only thing that feels solid. By the end of the 1980s, the AIDS crisis had already changed the entertainment world. Even when many people still avoided saying so plainly, friends vanished from address books. Familiar faces grew thin. Benefit concerts became part of the work because the need was everywhere. Peter kept showing up, but the private question was getting harder to avoid. How much longer could his body keep carrying the show? He had built a career on control. control of the room, control of the joke, control of what the public could see. Illness does not respect that kind of control. It waits until the makeup, the shirt, and the smile are no longer enough. By January of 1992, Peter Allen could no longer hide what was happening to his body. During concerts in Sydney, he began struggling with his breath and his voice. Doctors found a malignant lump in his throat, about the size of a golf ball. For any singer, that would be terrifying. For Peter, it hit the center of his life. His voice had carried him out of country New South Wales, into Judy Garland's circle, onto Broadway, and through years of grief, he was rarely allowed to name. He canceled the rest of his Australian tour and returned to the United States for treatment. Public statements stayed careful, as they often did in those years. First, the press spoke of throat cancer. After his passing, reports described it as an AIDS-related illness. Even then, the truth still had to pass through a layer of public management before it could be said plainly. Peter spent his final days near the Leucadia home he had once shared with Gregory Connell. That house had been one of the few places where their life could feel ordinary. Away from the audience, away from the cameras, away from the careful explanations, Peter did not have to turn himself into a product every hour of the day. On June 18, 1992, Peter Allen passed away at Mercy Hospital in San Diego. He was 48. A private memorial was held at his Leucadia home on June 21st. His ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean within sight of the house. For years, people reduced him to easy labels: Liza Minnelli's ex-husband, Judy Garland's Discovery, the man behind I Honestly Love You, and Arthur's Theme. But Gregory Connell was not a footnote. He was the man Peter loved, the man behind the lights, the man history too easily pushed into the background. Peter Allen made audiences feel alive. But the life he most wanted to protect was the one the business would not fully name. Hollywood knew how to sell his joy. It never knew how to honor his grief. If you believe these hidden Hollywood histories deserve to be told clearly, subscribe to the channel. We are here to remember the people the entertainment business praised, used, and too often asked to disappear.